One of the main things I think is making Shield Hero less enjoyable than it was before is the lack of context being given for the purpose of this arc. Like, there was hardly any justification provided for what this Tortoise is even doing, resulting in the past few episodes feeling like they're completely irrelevant to the story we built up in the first season. In actuality though, this giant kaiju is much more prevalent to the plot than the anime makes it seem. It's the initiation of the path Vittoria had been trying to avoid, one that saves the world but at the cost of significant life. So, what we'll cover in this cut content is the more pertinent details behind how the Spirit Tortoise and the waves are related. Everything you need to know to understand what exactly is happening right now. Keep in mind though that this does build upon information I've shared in my previous videos. So if you haven't yet had the chance to watch those, then you can find each of them linked down below in the description. But anyway, episode 29, The Country Above the Spirit Tortoise, covering chapter 16 from volume 6 and chapters 9 to 10 from volume 7. If you're wondering what the initial 8 chapters in between are, well, that's actually a massive rematch between Naofumi and the Spirit Tortoise, a lengthy second fight that takes place before Naofumi even enters the cave here. With that being such a prominent event in the novel though, I don't think it's something the anime would so casually disregard like that. So rather than focus on those lengthy chapters which will likely be covered later, I'll instead focus on the cut content from the chapters we did see. Events like the ruined village and the discovery of the Tortoise Shrine. Starting right after the tortoise had been slain, there was another meeting being held to discuss what's next, mainly because a couple things felt off about the whole endeavor. The first was that the fight felt way too easy, and the second was the fact that the blue hourglass still hadn't disappeared yet. That alone was enough to indicate the problem still wasn't solved yet. So, considering how much of this still remained a mystery, the logical next steps were to investigate the tortoise itself. Naofumi and the Queen would search the mountains that constituted its shell, while the 7-star heroes would divert to its land of origin to see if anything else was there. Then, if nothing could be found from that, they could at least backtrack the tortoise's path in search for clues of the other heroes. Remember, they were still missing after having tried to fight the tortoise themselves. No one knew what actually happened to them, but they were still alive as confirmed by Vittoria. So Naofumi could only hope they had run away after seeing how outmatched they were. Now, with that being the primary plan, it was the first village on the tortoise's back that had the shrine in it, an old temple that seemed to be dedicated to the Spirit Tortoise. The key thing to note from the mural inside was the Japanese message left behind by the previous heroes, a very degraded letter in which some of the words were missing. Of the ones we could see, the entire thing dictated this. It was a pretty broken statement that seemed to provide a warning. The first thing to stick out to Naofumi was the connection between the number 7 and its mention with the seal. Perhaps whatever this 7 was the reason the seal had broken in the first place. The next word to stick out after was the keyword goal in the next line. There wasn't very much to go on regarding what this referenced, but the following lines of sacrifice seemed to align with what Vittoria had been saying. So, when taking the context of what he knew from her, Naofumi was able to piece together the goal this sacrifice was being made for. Now, the last 2 things to note about this message was the number 8, which Naofumi couldn't relate to anything, as well as the apparent scratch marks which indicated the section on how to defeat it was erased on purpose. Those were the 2 aspects Naofumi couldn't really make sense of. That said, there was also a very real possibility that the writing could mean something different depending on the hero who wrote it. Just like how Ren and the others came from a Japan different from Naofumi's, so too was it possible their Japanese characters meant something different. I mean, just the passing of time makes certain words start to bear different meanings. So, even if this message was written in a way Naofumi could understand, there was no certainty that his interpretation would be the same as the one the original writer intended for it. That's why such care needed to be taken when deciphering messages like this one. Now, this next part isn't really all that important, but I do find it interesting with the way it's portrayed in the anime. You see, the soldiers weren't all respectful and melancholic like how they showed us here. Well, at least not yet anyway. When Naofumi had finished searching the temple, he had come out to find the soldiers were actually about to loot the castle, the place he was planning to investigate next. That being the case, he couldn't just let them take whatever they wanted when some valuable information could be there. So, while he continued to investigate the rest of the mountain, the old lady, Eclair, and Philo would work with the queen to stop any looting. And that's a small aspect I feel would have added quite a bit more to the anime. It's not very important to the plot, but the incorporation of it does make the whole situation seem a bit more real. I I mean, it's only natural that after a disaster such as this, all sorts of nefarious types would be attracted to take advantage of it. It's an additional layer of depravity to an already grim situation, something the anime was only able to portray through partially rotting corpses. Now, with that being the last chapter from Volume 6, it's the next ones from Volume 7 that really delve into Naofumi's efforts to find the other heroes. Remember, this was the whole reason he'd even come out here in the first place. Unless he could find the other heroes, then the only option left to stop the waves was through monumental sacrifice. So, it was after a week of non-stop searching that Naofumi would finally come across Ost for the very first time. But rather than her showing up to the meeting with the Coalition, her first true appearance was actually during an intense fight with the zombie chimera, an enemy Naofumi wouldn't have been able to kill if not for her assistance. In fact, this zombie chimera had such a high regenerative ability that the combined attacks of everyone still wasn't able to kill it. It was an unfathomably stronger and scarier version than the neutered one we got in the anime, much to the point that Naofumi was forced to nuke it with his Shield of Rage. Once that new type of enemy had been taken care of though, that's when Ost began to introduce herself much like how she did in the anime. The only difference is that she'd also brought with her a warning that the spirit tortoise had awakened, leading to a second and far more intense fight against it. For a bit more information on Ost herself though, well, aside from what we were shown in episode 2, there was a lot more context given to establish her purpose, stuff that explains the basis for this spirit tortoise arc in the first place. So, as we know from the anime, yes, she did manipulate countries in order to get them to fight, but the countless souls created would be used to stop the waves after. Regardless of whether they were monsters or humans, each gathered soul could be used to form a defensive barrier that would protect the world. Thus the whole sacrifice for the sake of the world thing. That being the case, that meant the spirit tortoise's whole existence amounted to a single purpose. It was created solely to kill anything and everything that would help to establish this barrier. It was a tool that would save the world through an unquantifiable amount of life. Now, this wasn't something Naofumi was completely against, but the way Ost spoke indicated that the amount of souls needed was apocalyptic. Like, if it wasn't pretty much the entire world at stake, then Naofumi had no problem letting the tortoise do whatever it wanted. So long as he was able to protect the people he cared for, then Naofumi couldn't care less about anyone else who died. That was just the person he was right now. In any case, it was after Ost had explained who she was that Naofumi then went on to find out how much she really knew. Perhaps she could explain what this new blue hourglass was. Well, according to her, this new symbol was an indication of how many souls had been gathered, and the 7 at the end referred to the wave's current power level. This was all the information she knew as an entity created to protect the world. There wasn't much else she could say about how the waves in general occurred, but she did know that they all paled in comparison to the one they would have to deal with next. You see, the previous waves were at most a level 2 or level 3 disaster. So if the next one was all the way at level 7, that meant it would be at least twice as hard as anything Naofumi had ever faced before. It was a level of difficulty he couldn't even begin to fathom. Now, the reason Ost was asking for his help was because the spirit tortoise's body had become unable to achieve its mission now. No longer was it gathering souls specifically for the purpose of creating a barrier. Instead, someone had taken control and was planning to use that energy for something else. That being the case, it made sense then that Ost was willing to do whatever she could to prevent those souls from being lost in vain. She couldn't allow her main body to simply be used as this medium to collect copious amounts of energy. She wasn't sure who or what the culprit was planning, but she knew for sure that they weren't trying to save the world. What's interesting to note about the culprit themselves, though, is that the person could only be someone who was capable of breaking the tortoise's seal. And that was knowledge only given to those who could defeat the tortoise in combat. So, with that being just the holy heroes and the vassal weapon wielders, there wasn't really an extensive list of people Ost had to search for. The key thing to focus on was identifying those strong enough to kill the tortoise. Thus the reason she had appeared before Naofumi here. Now, if we skip past the epic fight against the newly awakened spirit tortoise, that brings us to Naofumi's journey through the inner caves of its shell. A journey into the tortoise to find its heart and stop it for good this time. An important distinction that does need to be made though is that, unlike how the tortoise was still attempting to regenerate in the anime, it was actually mid-battle in the novels, resulting in this very prominent sense of urgency since every second spent in the cave was another second the coalition would have to spend fighting. It was a highly time-sensitive mission in which the longer it went, the more people they would lose. So, as waves and waves of familiars were fought the deeper they went, Naofumi would eventually come across Glass and the others, bringing us now to the end of episode 4. But yeah, that's pretty much a brief overview of what's been happening so far. The entire arc is just a convoluted way of showing us what Vittoria had been talking about last season. Now, Fumi could either work with the heroes and save the people, or he could let the Tortoise commit mass genocide and save the world. The only problem is that the Tortoise, as it was now, wasn't even doing that. Some unknown enemy had gone and turned this giant killing machine into their own personal mount. So, as I'm sure you now know, there's a lot more going on here than what the anime has led us to believe. It's just been presented in a way that doesn't really get the point across. In any case, that's all I got for today's cut content. Now, before I go, I do want to quickly highlight this new YouTube feature called Super Thanks. It's basically a new way to support the channel through the comments. By no means am I suggesting that any of you should use it, but if you do decide to, then I'll put your name at the end of the next video. It's the least I could do to say thanks for your generous support. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!